Hi guys, Jordan here from the Belfast City Mission Rathcoole. Just want to give you a little thought for Thursday. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but maybe we'll go with it. I want to read a couple of very familiar verses from Lamentations chapter 3, 22 to 24 says this: The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. The writer tells us of coming into contact here with God's never-ending mercies. They're fresh, new every morning, fresh as the air that maybe we're getting a little bit less of these days as we're kept indoors. But why? Why are they new every morning? Why is it that God does it that way? It's not because yesterday's mercies were bad or weak. They're new every morning. They're not like toilet paper that we can stockpile up for when we need it or when we think we're going to need it. It's not like bread that we can sort of hoard, but when we go to get it, it's going to be rotten. It's going to be mouldy. They're new every morning. They're like the manna in the wilderness. You can't keep it overnight. John Piper said this. He said, you live on God day by day, or you don't live on God at all. And if we read Lamentations, we can pluck this verse out of context. And if we do that, like with any verse of scripture, it's like only reading the left-sided pages of a novel. We might see part of the story, but we'll miss its true meaning. Lamentations is it's a collection of songs and poems of, as the name suggests, of lament. But Jeremiah, the guy who wrote Lamentations, what is it that he's lamenting? He's been writing about how difficult and about how depressing and how much of a trial his circumstances were as they were in captivity. He saw his city fall to an invading army. He's watched as the gates have been broken and burned. He's watched as his neighbours and his friends and his family have been attacked and killed. And in previous verses he's said things like this. I'll just go back to chapter 2 and he says this: Arise, cry out in the night at the beginning of the night watches. Pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands to him for the lives of your children who faint for hunger at the head of every street. A desperate picture here of parents pleading for their children in the dead of the night. Jeremiah talks about these awful things non-stop. He's even forgotten, if we looked at a couple of verses previous, he's forgotten what happiness is. I've forgotten, he says, what happiness is. My soul is bereft of peace. And maybe in these anxious days that we're living in, of empty shelves, of uncertainty of what the next hour or the next day is going to bring, we feel like that as well. Our soul is bereft of peace. But suddenly in this bleak account, we find that Jeremiah's thoughts are turned, they take a startling 180-degree turn towards the character of God. Jeremiah's entire world's falling apart, and yet here he writes these words of great hope, even though they're through bitter tears. This moment of dread and defeat, we find this glimmer of hope, this rock of truth that steps in, that he stands upon, that he holds on to. He says that the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, that his mercies never come to an end. The Hebrew word here for mercies is used around 250 times in the New Testament. It's a beautiful, sweeping, all-inclusive term for God's love, for his goodness, for his forgiveness, his compassion, indeed for his faithfulness. His mercies are not only new every morning, but they're like a relentless flood that we can't hold back. Throughout the history of mankind in Scripture, as we see the story unfold down through the pages, God's unmistakable pattern is seen again and again and again. God's people are constantly disobedient, and because of that disobedience there's consequences. But then when they come back to Him, and there's this confession, and that brings forgiveness, that brings renewal. And when Jeremiah thinks about this and meditates upon it, he remembers that God had many mercies available to His people again and again, every single day. And this statement here in verse 23 ends with 4 wonderful, powerful words. Great is your faithfulness. We live in a world filled with broken promises, with disappointments, with people who are unfaithful, including ourselves. So what are we to do? Jeremiah is struggling here with discouragement, but in the midst of it he focuses on God and on one particular characteristic of God, His faithfulness. And when we become discouraged, we should do what Jeremiah did as well. Stop and remember God's faithfulness. We need to, as I'm sure we have, because I say this is a very familiar verse that maybe we've known from we were in Sunday school. Memorize this verse, get into the habit of quoting it, singing it, writing it when we're discouraged, which we can be, and which we are from time to time, and maybe even we are right now. We need to remember, think about how God has answered our prayers. Think about how God has provided for us. Think about the courage and the strength that He has given us when we were afraid or timid. The love that He has given us when everyone else has let us down and disappointed us. And the faithfulness that He has shown to us when no one else has. The storms, though they might overwhelm us, what we need to do is reflect on this amazing truth. God's faithful. He's full of mercy. He never stops giving us what we don't deserve when we humbly approach Him. And it's God Himself, the Lord, is my portion. Jeremiah says, therefore I will hope in Him. He's the only one in whom we can and should place our hope. These words, they're just as true in times of peace as they are in times of trouble. They're more than just Insta-worthy captions. They're more than just things to put in a tweet or a Facebook post to make us smile. They're not simply there to make us feel better when things get hard, but they remind us of the reality of the gospel. God is a God of steadfast love, of mercies that never cease, that are in fact new every morning, a God who's great in His faithfulness, and therefore we should put our hope in Him. And in the midst of this present time that we're in, let's remember those words that Jeremiah penned and say them out loud. God, You're my portion, and I've put my hope in You. Have a good day, blessings, and I'll see you next time.